Hello and welcome to the third Exploring Happiness research video in 2020. For this one we're talking about the impact of COVID-19 on well-being, and we're looking at this, as with most of our research, from a policymaker's perspective. Our motivation for doing so is to broaden the conversation at the moment from just being focused on the impact of COVID-19 on the economy and focusing on other indicators that were important to consider, such as the well-being of the population. So fortunately the Office of National Statistics in the UK have been measuring the population's well-being since 2011, and they've been doing so on a regular basis so we can get a nice clear direction of whether things are improving or getting worse for well-being. And it's the basis of this data that we used to produce our analysis of how this year's pandemic has impacted the population's well-being. We've got a few findings that we're going to outline in this video. So the first is that the impact on well-being, unsurprisingly, has been quite large. So for example, the decline in measures of life satisfaction and happiness have declined larger than the previous range for those variables before the pandemic began. So for example, for the happiness measure, just before the pandemic, the average score across all the participants in the survey was 7.65. It's now equal to exactly 7, so it's fallen by 0.65 points. And the range previously, for the last 9 or so years, was only 0.35 points. So it's a really big decline that we've seen this year as an impact of all the things that we've had to do to react to the pandemic. The second finding that we had was that we produced our own kind of illustrative forecast. It needs some work, but it showed how, based on some assumptions, how we might expect well-being measures to change in the future. And based on this analysis, we feel that this is useful for policymakers, because when they're deciding on what policies to put in place, they can not only think about the impact now, but they can also think about the impact in the future of their policies for well-being. The third finding that we had was that non-financial indicators are having a bigger impact on well-being than financial indicators. So this is kind of adds to our initial point as to broadening the focus of what we should be looking at when deciding which policies to put in place. We're finding that things like the lack of socialising, the impact on people's relationships, the impact on mental health, are all having a bigger impact on well-being than perhaps the financial impacts that we've seen so far. And the last point that we would like to make from our analysis is that well-being inequality is also likely to increase as a result of the pandemic. And that's because, based on the economic indicators, we're seeing that there's quite a divergence in terms of outcomes. So some of the wealthiest in society are actually getting wealthier as a result of the pandemic, and then large swathes of poor people are being much more heavily impacted by the pandemic. And there are also social impacts. For example, poorer ends of society don't have as many outdoor spaces, so the impacts of lockdown policies, for example, are more difficult for them. So that's what we would like to outline to you for the video, but please do take a look at the article. There's a lot more information in there, and thanks very much for listening.